Morning all, let's have a look at one of the great games in the Tal Memorial tournament of 2013, which was Magnus Carlsen playing white against Vishy Anand playing black. Magnus kicked off with d4. So is this game going to be an indicator of their match later this year, their World Championship match? Vishy responded with knight f6, and after c4, e6, the sign that he's interested in either a Nimzo Indian if white plays knight c3 or Queen's Indian territory if white plays knight f3. Magnus on this occasion played knight c3, inviting the pin, so named after the great Aaron Nimzovich. The Nimzo Indian system remains a reliable and very popular opening system. White now plays e3, which is Rubinstein's move, a very solid variation against the Nimzo Indian. Black now castled, and now a slightly unusual move, not the most popular, knight ge2 on ChessBase live book. Bishop d3 is with 5,467 games. Knight ge2 second most popular, 2,141. So slightly off the top used move in this position. It has particular ideas though. First of all, of course, the structure can be maintained, no double pawns. The bishop being hemmed in here means that white will need to often go for a fianchetto. So let's see what happened. d5. And now, given that the bishop is not going to cause structural damage, the move a3 is very logical here. Black doesn't want to give up the bishop under this circumstances. Here, he's not going to double the pawns, he just retreats the bishop to e7. And here now, Magnus plays c takes d5, trying to fix a pawn on d5, but black doesn't have to take with the pawn here, and in fact, okay, the taking with the pawn is actually the most popular move. There's also knight takes d5 as in the game. So we see knight takes d5, and now white plays bishop d2. So let's see, if knight takes c3, there's options there. Maybe the bishop would be nice on c3, but Vishy now plays knight d7. Let's see on opening book, this is the most popular move in this position with 45 games, taking on c3, 5, c5, 3 games, and it goes on. So knight d7 is the most popular move. Now we see g3, logical to put more pressure on d5 to carry on development, to try and castle. And here Vishy plays a slightly offbeat move. The most popular move here that's been played before is moving the knight, this knight, back to f6. The second most popular is taking on c3. b6 has been played 5 times before. It's small game samples, and they're all supposed to be about equal. The evaluation of these moves here are all in theory about equal. So b6. In this position, Magnus takes the opportunity now to take on d5. Now that the bishop is committed, well, creating some light square weaknesses as well to fianchettoing, taking on d5, the bishop can't be using this diagonal, and this pawn could be a target now on d5. So after e takes d5, bishop g2. Pressure along the diagonal, and potentially white wants to kind of probe these light square weaknesses later as well, and maybe try and clamp down on black's freeing move, which is often c5. So let's see, bishop b7, and a very, very interesting move now. We're really out of theory here. Magnus plays what seems to be a move you'd be interested in playing, for example, against the Dutch stonewall. In the Dutch stonewall, you're interested in trading off the dark square bishops. It's a standard positional method as a prelude to like a dark square campaign to weaken black on the dark squares if you can exchange off this bishop. White's dark squares are fairly solid here. The structure is fairly solid. In fact, all the pawns here are on dark squares. So that would leave a very complementary bishop on g2 with that pawn structure. Now this next move, bishop b4, is very, very interesting, not only accepting the possibility of double pawns, but let's have a quick look at c5 as a forcing move response. Simply, I believe this is a good continuation for white. D takes c5, b takes, and now dropping the bishop back, knowing that the pawn's pinned to b7. And this is quite comfortable for white. And the reason, if we just demonstrate, is that white can undermine these hanging pawns with the move b4 in this scenario. For example, castles, queen b6, b4. Once this undermining happens, white will get, it seems, the d4 square with a small and nagging advantage. For example, bishop a6, we can take on c5 and play bishop d4. So the hanging pawns can transform into an isolated queen's pawn in this particular scenario. So that shows some of the power of bishop b4. That if it's responded to with c5, we'll first get hanging pawns, which can later quite quickly transform into a bad isolated queen's pawn. What other thing black can do is obviously bishop takes b4. So why would white want doubled pawns here? Okay, he has weakened black on the dark squares. Is white actually threatening anything? Well, there's going to be more pressure maybe on d5, and in this scenario with pressure on d5, b5 will be a useful resource against c6. So this is quite a dangerous pawn to have on b4, potentially undermining black's protection of that d5 pawn, because white's really geared up to put loads of pressure here on d5. If black tries to free his game rather with c5, let's see, again we see that this could lead to an unfavourable isolated queen's pawn, for example taking, and white again you'll see has control over this key d4 square here, which is a small advantage for white in this scenario. So this is a very interesting situation where white is seemingly guaranteed a small advantage whatever black does here, whether it's c5 or bishop takes b4. So Vishy, he plays knight f6, and now white castles, rook e8. It's not really attacking anything. White's structure is very solid here. Rook c1, and this, by contrast, that is a subject of attack, that c7 pawn, and something is done about it. Vishy plays c6. At least he knows that there's no pawn on b4 to undermine with b5 at the moment. But now white takes off the dark square bishop, so he's leaving himself with a harmonious bishop with all his pawns on dark squares, very harmonious for the pawn structure and pieces. This bishop, is it better than this one? This is more defensive. This is looking at black's pawn here. It seems black has great control over the e-file at the moment, and white would not dream of being able to break in the centre. It seems only at the moment that c6 might be a target. We see though the move rook e1, and this is what Nc3 would call a mysterious rook move. It doesn't seem to be doing anything because, as mentioned, it seems black has a great control over the e4 square. How will white ever break in the future with f3 and e4? Well, let's see what happened. Queen d6, and now knight f4. Okay, this is a very nuisance knight. Black doesn't want to do a horrific weakening move. There's always knight h5, for example. The knight is difficult to evict. Let's have a quick look at how bad that is. Or even just knight d3, and you can see the dark squares. With that absence of the dark square bishop, this sort of thing is just horrible. It's already kind of precarious on the dark squares. So we see in this position though, it looks like a slightly dubious move from Vishy to play this move. It looks quite on the defensive. The move bishop c8 is played here, perhaps as an alternative, and it still looks quite miserable, but probably quite playable for a draw. Rook c8, let's see rook c8. If white wants to clamp down on c5, and again, at very least, even if it's not prevented, white will get the d4 square in many cases. Let's say black plays rook e7, ec7, queen a4. This is an uncomfortable position for black, but this pawn cannot be taken because of rook a8. In this kind of situation, the engines give just a small advantage for white, but there's potential for great torture. You can imagine knight d3, and black's game is very restricted, with c5 never being on the cards. White can sit here and torture black, it seems, for quite some time. Okay, so Vishy's bishop c8 though, slightly weakening c6, and it's this weakness of the last move, slightly c6 slightly more vulnerable. Queen a4 attacking c6, forcing a defensive move of some sort. Now if bishop d7 here, rook c7 was played in the game, but if bishop d7, it seems again this dark square campaign can be continued with the queen now, with queen b4. If the queens come off here, you'll see again c5 and e5, this knight d3 is very beautiful in this position. And also white's immediately threatening things like b5 as well. For example, a5, b5 can be very unpleasant. This kind of scenario could be very unpleasant for black, losing that center pawn. These pawns are ready to roll in the center, so this would be a nice advantage for white, almost a clear advantage perhaps. So okay, much easier to play there. So we see here that queen b4 is attractive, but after rook c7 it might even be playable here, queen b4, but what was played might be even more powerful. The move Magnus plays, because you see this rook move took pressure off e4, and before we thought, well, what about this mysterious rook move? Well, now it's more justified. We see the mysterious rook move coming into its own because white plays f3. And this kind of plan goes back to Mikhail Botvinnik, this kind of f3-e4 plan against various systems. So white is extending in the center, not only threatening potentially to win a piece, but just the central pawns would be very dangerous. You might think, surely there's a downside to this. Well, there's no dark square bishops. Usually when you play a move like f3 and e4, you've got to be wary about this diagonal, but there's no dangers on this diagonal here. So black can't actually do anything here against e4. If he moves the rook back, obviously he's going to lose c6. What can he do against e4? So he has to wait for e4. He has to try and keep solid. He plays bishop e6. So now e4. What about the d4 pawn, you might think? Isn't that slightly vulnerable here? Well, d takes e4 is played. If black just sits back against, say, e5, I think this starts to be quite nasty. But what can black do? If he plays knight e8, what would be quite good here? Maybe rook e2, or just knight takes e6. And now f4. This looks pretty nasty. White looks to have a nice advantage here in this position. Okay, so knight d7 I think looks even worse. In fact, this could be immediately losing here because of rook takes c6. So this might actually be a playable move here, knight e8, without losing material straight away. If there's a move other than d takes e4, so knight e8. Also potentially, I mean, engine suggestion, queen d7 here might be a playable move. Again, ready to give up the light square bishop. This might be a case of lesser evil move already in this position. That either of these two moves, queen d7 or knight e8. But in the game we see d takes e4. I think this must increase logically white's advantage after f takes e4. These pawns seem very, very good together here. Black's lost some central control. White not only has the e5 option, now white has the d5 option with the absence of black's d5 pawn. So that's why these other two moves might be considered lesser evil moves, knight e8 or queen d7, rather than d takes. And you might think, well, b5 here to try and lure the queen away from d4. Simply the queen would go to b4 here, attacking the queen. No problem. And even in this position, even the move queen d1 could be still an advantage for white as well. But queen b4 or even e5 here. So there's no forcing move here, it seems, that's any good for black. Vishy plays the defensive move queen d7. Okay, what is white actually threatening? Well, e5 is the main threat to win material, so queen d7 gets out of the way. And what is the better move for black here then? It seems actually, even though b5 looks terrible, it might actually be one of the better moves here. This is a pretty dire position for b5 to be one of the better moves. Let's have a quick look. So b5, say taking, it's a very big advantage for white here after rook c3. White threatening to just double rooks and torture c6. It's going to end up winning material pretty soon. So in this position, queen d7. And I find this astonishing. This is at move 22 now against the current world champion at 2786. What I find astonishing here is this combination that is played now. It's a forcing combination basically. Magnus plays d5. He temporarily goes a pawn down. So after c takes d5, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, he's temporarily a pawn down. And you might think, well, was the idea e takes d5? Let's see, e takes d5 doesn't do much. Bishop f5, if we try d6, black can just get out of the way. In fact, this is now a weak pawn. Thanks very much. No, but the idea here is not e takes d5. This idea reminds me of a classic Karpov-Kasparov game where Kasparov was playing the Tarrasch in one of their first World Championship encounters and had an isolated queen's pawn in one of the games. And I think we've covered the game on this channel, and the way Karpov exploited the isolated queen's pawn was a capture on e6 to make a more exploitable weakness. And here Magnus uses this kind of Karpovian idea that to exploit the isolated queen's pawn, sometimes you're de-isolating it. Knight takes e6. Why would white do this? Well, it weakens black's king, and it takes away that quite defensive light square bishop, which was adding solidity to black on the light squares. So after f takes e, that lack of solidity now is underlined with this next move from Magnus. Can you spot it? What does Magnus play in this position? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop h3. Horrible threats with bishop h3. What can black do to defend this? This would be a disaster, for example. Just taking here, and now we've got bishop takes e6 coming next. If rook e8, we can take on d5. And again, say knight takes, then we've got bishop takes e6 check. And now black has major issues losing the rook. So what actually can black do about bishop h3? It looks like such a simple but effective move here. So what's really happened, this diagonal's been ruptured. Black's really quite weak on the light squares. So from a pawn down position, this position being a pawn down is actually, it seems quite crushing. If rook d6 just runs into e5, so there's actually, it seems very little black can do here. Vishy tries king h8, giving back the pawn, but it's not taken immediately. If taking the pawn, that could be good as well. This is also good. e5. Now Vishy plays the miserable retreat here, knight g8. If he had played knight e4, let's have a quick look at knight e4. Bishop takes e6. If he doesn't want to lose d5, he'll move that back to protect d5. But now rook c7. And this is unpleasant. White is potentially threatening. Bishop d7 for e6 or rook d1. So this knight doesn't seem too relevant in this position. Okay, but in the game this looks miserable as well. Knight g8. So White's getting his pawn back, and we see rook d8. Can't afford to lose that d5 pawn. But now this invasion on the 7th rank, rook c7. A horrible position. What is White actually threatening? You might ask. Well, rook f1 and rook f7 just to double on g7 is one idea. But there's also other ideas, maybe bishop d7 for e6. So in the game we see d4, which I think rules out this plan, because this d pawn might provide some counterplay. For example, rook f1. Well, there's always rook e8 as well. So these are potentially vulnerable, but Magnus stops them from being vulnerable and uses a different plan here. He plays bishop d7. So he's cutting off the protection of this d pawn, ready for e6 and just to collect this pawn, or just rook d1 or rook e4 as the major threats here. In this position, Vishy was not happy at all with his position, and so unhappy he resigned. I think we need to check out some example continuations here, why it's absolutely dead lost for black. Let's try a knight move, knight e7. Rook e4. That pawn is dropping off. Surely. Okay, attacking the rook. Either taking or e6. There's a cheapo threat there. But this is an example. So now White is ready for taking and maybe e6. So did Vishy actually have to play d4 just earlier in this position? Why did he have to play d4 is another question. What does he play here if he doesn't play d4? Let's say g6. Bishop d7 again, nevertheless. Now rook f1, and what's the threat? e6 maybe, or rook f7. Let's see if we give black a token move. Let's say rook b8, what would happen? e6, e7, rook f7, and it's all about black's king safety here. It's not even about the pawn here. So say the knight moves, black's king is called into question after bishop c6. So this is one of the ideas, that this 7th rank, it can be absolutely devastating here if black does nothing. So because you might be wondering why would Vishy play this d4 move, weakening the pawn? So if he does nothing, White will just double on the 7th ranks here, on the 7th rank. Let's give another alternative then. a6, again, this doubling process. Say black tries like this. Can black take on e5? No, he loses a8 here anyway. Taking. And again, once the rooks reach the 7th rank here, this is now a winning position for White. This kind of situation is winning. this kind of rook ending. So king g2 would tuck the king on h3 if needed, or coming to f3. But yeah, there was still, it's lost, but some explanations needed here for d4, I think, and bishop d7, why black resigned. So I think this idea of just doubling here is very, very powerful on the 7th rank. Okay, hope you got something out of that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.